So thank you and welcome. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to the Natural Areas Association webinar, New Interest in Old Forest, Creating an Assessment Method for Pennsylvania Old Growth. So the Natural Areas Association is a national nonprofit that serves practitioners who manage ecologically significant landscapes to protect biodiversity. NAA's mission is to get quality science and best practices into the hands of those who can make an impact on the ground by sharing applied science, practical solutions, and knowledge transfer. Jaci Braund is an ecologist with the Pennsylvania Natural Heritage Program located in Harrisburg, PA. Her ecology work primarily involves classifying plant communities within Pennsylvania and researching old growth forests. Jaci has been spearheading this project in old growth forests, Pennsylvania since 2021 and is developing an assessment method for the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources Bureau of Forestry. So Jaci, welcome. And I know we're all looking forward to seeing your presentation today.
All right, everybody. Thank you for being here. My name is Jaci Braund. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to the Natural Areas Association for having me today. My talk is titled New Interests in Old Forest at Creating an Assessment Method for Pennsylvania Old Growth, and it is about the development of this assessment method as part of a larger project on old growth forest in Pennsylvania. Here we go. Okay, so I'd like to get us started with a poll, so hopefully Moira can pull that up for us. And I'm interested in your involvement with old growth forests. Perhaps you've conducted studies, you conduct management in old growth forests. Maybe you've just visited old growth forests. I'm interested in seeing where our audience is at with this topic. While you're filling that out, I'll start by saying that it really wasn't until relatively recently and during my ecology career that I began to learn about old growth. So it's been really eye-opening over the last few years to really take a deep dive into this topic. And I certainly didn't knowingly visit old growth until about 2021. So I'm pretty new to all of this. All right, Maura, if you could give me a notice whenever that's all set. Okay, great. Okay, looks like we have lots of folks who manage or work on properties with old growth forests. Some people have done research, and there's just lots who are interested in learning about old growth forests. Great. Thank you for filling that out. Next slide. Here we go. Okay, so I'll start with a little bit of background on this project. So after several years of collecting data on plant communities in Pennsylvania, I started to become interested in which of our plant communities may be better at sequestering carbon than others. After some research, I learned about old growth forests and their carbon holding capabilities. So there's extensive research on this topic, and it's not going to be something I'm going to focus on for this talk. I did pull out a few quotes off some literature that I thought really summarized it really well, such as this one in the middle from Mark Anderson. So whole tree carbon accumulation rate increases with age and size, or as forests age, the total amount of carbon stored in the forest continues to increase as carbon accumulates in different pools. So there's just lots and lots of literature on this topic. So there's lots of background for that. But like I said, it's not the focus of this talk. It was sort of my initial motivation with going down this research road, though. But so once I learned that old growth forests are these carbon sinks, the next natural step for me was wondering where they were located. The goals for this project were defined in 2021, with the first field season being in 2022. So this project is still in its infancy and a work in progress. I mentioned my initial motivation with carbon sinks that translated to old growth forests. And so I wanted to know where they were located, and that I quickly learned that I didn't really know how to identify them in the field. So the first goal of this project was to determine how to identify old growth. And then being with the Pennsylvania Natural Heritage Program, I work with a lot of really great people who are really good at surveying for rare plants and animals. So we'd added on surveys for potential associate species for old growth forests, and potentially being able to build an indicator species list off of those surveys. And then lastly, my funder for this project is the Bureau of Forestry in Pennsylvania. So we are creating best management practices for old growth and mature forests on state forest land. So this talk is focusing on the process myself and colleagues created to identify old growth in PA over the last few years. So as many research projects start off, you start with some pretty simple questions and then it spirals from there. So our simple questions were, where is old growth in Pennsylvania and what is old growth? And then finally, how to identify it. So I'll go through each of these and how they guided the development of this assessment method. Well, when I talk to people about Pennsylvania old growth, most think we don't have any. We do, but however, old growth is not common due to historical deforestation. Most of you have probably seen photos similar to these. These are from the Pennsylvania State Archives, and it said they were from Tioga County around the year 1900. So timber harvest during the early years was completely unsustainable, as many of us know. This deforestation peaked around the year 1900 to 1920. However, prior to all of this and prior to European settlement, this much of Pennsylvania was in an old growth condition. So through this deforestation, this unsustainable harvesting, this has really limited our understanding of what old growth can be like in Pennsylvania. My next button doesn't seem working. So continuing on here, first, in order to learn how to identify old growth in Pennsylvania, I did some research to locate well-known old growth areas to equate myself with their characteristics. So we're fortunate to have some really popular and protected old growth forests in Pennsylvania. Tionesta Scenic and Research Natural Area, Cook Forest State Park, and then there's also Heart's Content Recreation Area. Tionesta and Cook Forest are both several thousand acres, while Heart's Content is only about 100. And these are probably all conserved for hunting many years ago. The rest of old growth areas in Pennsylvania are much more incidental than these. So there's sort of a few categories I think of when I'm thinking about old growth and why we have it. So the first being, it was actually conserved during this deforestation wave. And then this next category I like to think of is that it was too steep or rocky for 19th century timber harvesting. This first area is called, as an example of this, is Mount Logan Natural Area. So it features only actually a few acres of old growth hemlocks. But in order to get to those, you have to first traverse this very rocky talus slope. Another example is Joyce Kilmer Natural Area, and this is much larger, but you first have to climb 1,000 feet of elevation to go straight up a mountain in order to get to it. So both of these two places were probably just simply too steep and too rocky for the early timber harvesting. Another instance of old growth in Pennsylvania is due to mapping errors. This seems to be a common occurrence for a few old growth sites. So this map, the screenshot of this map I have is for Duttlinger Natural Area. And I saw online that it was spared due to a dispute between two lumber companies. So the old growth area is about down in here. And it was apparently just one company thought the other company owned it, and then it just never was cut. Another example is the Hemlock's Natural Area, where I assume it is, because this is within a very narrow ravine. It's only about 1.5 miles wide. So it's just really long and narrow, and it kind of seems like it was a mapping error there as well. And lastly, a few old growth sites were probably locations of streamside refuge for timber crews. Laurel Hill State Park features about 5 acres of old growth hemlocks along a stream. And Bear Run Natural Area is about 18 acres of old growth also along a stream. So these are all just examples of why we have old growth. I kind of like, because the historical deforestation was so widespread and so rampant, I am always asking myself, first of all, what reason was this area spared? Okay, moving on to our next question. What is old growth? So defining old growth has been an ongoing debate and challenge for many decades. Charles Cogbill created this thesaurus of old growth forest concept, and I think it's a really great visual for thinking about how to define old growth. So you can see he has all these terms associated with old growth forests, and some of them are a little bit more forestry related when thinking about old growth forests, such as the word unmerchantable is in there, or that's a little more related to age, thinking of the word ancient. Ecological is more of a concept when it comes to old growth forests. So late successional is a term that's ecological. Spiritual also comes up when thinking about old growth forests. So the words majestic or cathedral. So there's just a lot of different terms people have used over the last several decades when thinking about old growth forests. However, scientists do still attempt to settle on a definition. So this project is using the Bureau of Forestry definition, which is also the Forest Stewardship Council definition. So both virgin stands and those that experience some level of timbering since European settlement. More recently, the federal government set out to define and inventory old growth and mature forests. And they created over 200 definitions for different forest types across the US. It is much more technical and it uses extensive plot data to determine tree size and large trees per acre to define old growth. And lastly, I came across this paper I thought was pretty neat. This is a group that published some work in 2023 that where they're defining old growth based on carbon models. So there's lots of different efforts to continue to define old growth and lots of really excellent research. There are still some themes and contradictions that come up for me when I'm thinking about answering this question, what is old growth? Sometimes I like to describe old growth as a continuity of a forested system where it's just continually been forested for a very, very long time. But then when I say that, I immediately think, well, what about wetlands or what about grasslands? And then sometimes big trees and this old growth character always come up when thinking about defining old growth, but these features are not always present in an old growth forest. And then lastly, just this lack of timber harvest is a unifying concept with old growth forests, but a forest can recover after a timber harvest. So adding to the pool of definitions is not in the scope of this project, but it is important to think about identifying these characteristics associated with old growth forests. And then I am creating this weighted score based off of these old growth characteristics. So with thinking about defining old growth and all of its variabilities, I wanted to hone in on an identification of old growth characteristics and how to recognize them in the forest. I've been identifying plants and plant communities in the field for many years, and I really wanted to apply this concept to old growth. I wanted to be able to go out there and see a certain number of characteristics or a certain level of characteristics, and then be able to say, this is old growth because XYZ is here and present. So I began to review some literature on structural characteristics of old growth forests, and there was lots of great research out of the Pacific Northwest and also New England. However, Pennsylvania is definitely not the Pacific Northwest, and the southern half of Pennsylvania is much different than New England. So I wasn't sure how many of these characteristics and structural features I was finding in the literature really applied to Pennsylvania. I did find some assessment methods and relevant literature, though, and on these old growth structural characteristics. And then I formed these all into field methods with a weighted scoring system, and I call it my old growth rapid assessment, and we're on the third version of it. So the field data collection method involves 4 points along a 200-meter transect. This is a screenshot of a map from some points I collected in the field. So the surveyor uses a large tree as the center point of a circular plot, and the circular plot is a 10-meter radius. And we'll collect qualitative data on old growth characteristics, also collect some forestry metrics such as diameter at breast height of all the trees within the 10-meter radius, basal area, and percent cover of coarse woody debris. I also created a survey 123 form to collect the data in the field. This is a screenshot of a slightly older version. Each of the qualitative characteristics is on a scale that I can assign a number to. So if we're seeing just a few of the characteristics, and the form's much longer than this, but I just decided to include just the top section of it. So if we're seeing just a few of the characters, then that translates to a 1 on the back end of the form. Or if it's more common, that'll be a 2. If it's frequent, it's assigned a number 3. And the basal area and the diameter breast height are also divided into numerical categories. So the idea for a weighted score was born out of observing these assorted contradictions in old growth character identification, where there are big trees are an identifying character of old growth forests, but they're not always present. Or there are old trees in old growth forests, but they're not always present either. Whereas thinking is some of these characters are more common and thus more important when thinking about old growth, but there are also others that are important for consideration. So if the forest scores above a certain number on the weighted score, it can be considered old growth. And that was sort of this leading motivation of a question when creating this is like, can we get that number to work? So I have some results to show you a little later on during this talk. But I will be going through each of the characters here shortly and the associated weights I've assigned them in the next several slides. So the numerical score for each of the character is assigned in the field. And like I said, it is on the back end of the form. And then when I download the Survey123 form back onto the computer, then I pull it all into a spreadsheet and multiply that numerical score in the field by the assigned weight. And so I've also just recently split this form out into the weighted scoring system out into 4 different versions based on forest type. So I have one for northern hardwood forest, dry oak heath forest, hemlock white pine, northern hardwood forest, and then miscellaneous forest. Okay, so let's look at some of the characters and their associated weights. So this first section of the weighted score I refer to as tree features. And like I said, all of these criteria came out of literature and also different observations in the field, so they are all related to old growth forests. So for tree features, these are all the same for each of the different forest types. I will review each character a little more thoroughly a little later on. So you can see that these all have just a 1% weight. So that's the lowest percentage you can have in this weighted score, because they could all apply to a single large tree in a forest. And so that if all of these features were on a single large tree, then that might not be entirely indicative of an old growth forest. That could be considered perhaps that's a wolf tree. If you're familiar with wolf trees, they are basically where the landscape was cleared for agriculture, except a tree that was maybe reserved for farm animals and such to take shade under, and then the land grew back in, the forest grew back in. So there's just one really large tree in the middle of a much younger forest. So then the scoring criteria for each of these, I just made it large. They're the same for each of these criteria. So again, there's these numbers assigned to it. So if you're in the field and you're not really seeing any of these buttress stumps, it would score a 0, and then that would zero it out on the form. Perhaps you're seeing several trees with these unique bark patterns, so then that would score a bit higher, and so on. The next category is called landscape features. So numerous large trees. This is the most common feature associated with old growth forests. The criteria that have a lower weight percentage reflect that they are not as significant, but they're still important for consideration. So moving back up here, live basal area still is an important feature of old growth forests, and there's some categories that I'll review shortly. Pit and mound topography, diverse coarse woody debris, and nursery logs. These are all still important features of old growth forests. So for this section and the following, the exact weights do vary slightly depending on the forest type. So for example, in this iteration, I have, for the dry oak heath forest type, I have pit and mound topography removed completely from that, and then the rest of the weights are adjusted, because I was finding that in rocky forests, the trees were tending to snap off instead of tipping up completely. So, and that was really common in dry oak heath forests. Okay, and here's some of the scoring criteria for each character. So lots of details here, but it's pretty similar. So if you're not seeing any of the nursery logs, it's a 0. But if you're seeing 3 or more, then it's going to score a bit higher. For diverse coarse woody debris, we have several decay classes that we refer to. Oh, here's the ranges for the basal area. So this was pulled out of several research papers where scientists were recording basal area in old growth forests. So I made it into some categories based on that. And then again, with the numerous large trees, are we seeing none or are we seeing more than a few of them? And so we're also recording DBH or diameter at breast height data within the plot. And so this is however many large live trees and or standing dead, and these are the weights for those. And this is again from some research, and I have Moira will have the list of references I'm referring to, and it'll also be at the end of this presentation. But this is from some research as well, where they were documenting the amount of large trees in a certain area. And so I did a bit of conversions to fit it in with my data. What was interesting about this is the research that I was referring to was out of New England, and they were their criteria was 50 centimeters for a large tree. And so I bumped it up to 60. I think 60 is a little more appropriate for Pennsylvania, and I'll go into that a little while later on. But these are the scoring criteria for that. And lastly, land use is also included on this. So forests can recover after alterations. So I didn't want to completely exclude this. But you'll see that, so if these features are common, then it will result in a low score. A few of these features won't really affect it much. And then if none of these are present, then it'll score positively. Okay, so those are all the weights and the different criteria. Here they all are together on this slide. These are all equal 100%. And so this is all repeated 4 times along that 200-meter transect. Let's look at some of the examples of tree features. So this first one is called buttress stumps, and this is a large flaring of the base of the tree. And these are all things I'm looking for when I'm doing this transect to see, am I seeing these features that I'm going to be recording it in that survey 1, 2, 3 form in order to get a score or a metric to see if this is an older forest or not. This next one is referred to as highly sinuous trunk, and it is a reflection of the tree bending towards available light over time. So you can see there's a big bends in these trunks here. This is a good example. This tree just has almost a perfect S bend in it. These two on the right and left are both black cherries, so they probably germinated in a light gap. And then this one in the middle doesn't bend so much sinuosity, but it is just tilting very severely. So these are all I refer to as highly sinuous trunk. This next one is really difficult to take photos of, but it's called low stem taper. Essentially, the trunk does not taper or tapers very little or becomes smaller towards the crown. So it's much more uniform the entire length of the trunk. This photo on the left is a large white pine that goes straight up. So it's hard to see in the photos. Like I said, this one's hard to take pictures of, but basically the trunk is much more cylindrical and it doesn't really taper as it goes up towards the crown. Unique bark patterns are a common feature of old trees. So this is the tertiary bark that is coming in on the tree. There's bald spots, it's peeling really irregularly. Most of these old trees, when they have this, they're nearly unrecognizable in their old age because the bark just looks so different. Those of us who learn to identify trees based on the bark, most of us have a hard time identifying these old growth trees. These have a really high wildlife value, this peeling bark feature. Okay, this one is called large lateral branches. So it's basically a reflection of repeated storm events that have dropped branches over time. The crown kind of looks like a head of broccoli a little bit, where it looks really battered and maybe leans more to one side over the other. And some of those branches that come out, they can be a larger diameter than some of the other trees on the ground. They're just really large, large branches up at the top. This is the same idea, large lateral branches, but it's specifically for hemlocks, is what I've noticed them looking a little bit differently. They end up kind of looking like I've seen this a few times, where it's a bit of like a saguaro cactus. It has this arm of a branch, or the branches I call them looking wiggly. I don't really have a better way to describe it at this time, but they just end up looking like where they probably had many smaller branches and then after many storms dropped them and they end up looking kind of awkward like that. Okay, so that was all of the tree features. And again, those all have a low weight to them because every single one of those features could be on a single large tree. So then they all have a low weight. Okay, next we're going to look at landscape features, starting with nursery logs. So nursery log is basically, there's a few different versions of this I've seen in the forest where this first one on the left, it kind of looks like the roots are stilted. So this means that it probably germinated on a log and then the log decayed and now it just is elevated off of the ground like that. Another example is, or all of these trees were about the same size and all growing almost in a straight line back away from the camera in this angle. So they probably all germinated on a log together and then grew up together. And lastly, I'm seeing just little tiny birch seedlings on this decaying log here. So this is nursery logs, I guess, are just thinking of this continuity of a forest where these trees are continuing to grow and continuing to rely on each other for germination locations. Diverse coarse woody debris. So that one, the previous slide and this one, they're a little bit more significant when it comes to old growth identification. So these are both 11%. So we use a scale of 1 to 5 for decay classes for coarse woody debris. So 1 indicates it was something that's freshly fallen. Maybe it still has leaves or branches, small branches on it. And then on the opposite end is a 5, where it's almost completely decayed. This does not include the standing dead trees. That's captured a different way. So with the weighted score, I'm thinking about how many decay classes are represented. If it's diverse or more than 3, indicates that there's a continual supply of wood to the forest floor. Next is called pit and mound topography. So this refers to the undulation on the forest floor caused by tree mortality over time. This depends on local conditions, but can take several decades to hundreds of years to fully develop. And I think this graphic was really great. I found this online. So as the tree dies and it tips over, this whole root plate is exposed. And then after several years, the tree starts to decay. And so we have this big pit from where that root plate pulled up. And then this paper said after 50 to 60 years, the tree decays. And then there's this large pit and a big mound associated with that. I've seen more like 200 years for hemlocks to fully decompose. So I think that the actual rate of decomposition depends on local conditions. So here's some example photos. Here's me standing next to a fresh tip up mound. And you can see there's all this soil exposed. These are also great germination environments for seedlings, and it's really quite tall, so it's leaving a very large pit. And then this is the opposite. This is just a very slight, small pit in the forest with a little bit of a mound here, but then there's no log, there's no tree trunk any longer that has already fully decomposed. So basal area is also recorded with a 10-factor prism from the center point of the plot. I pulled these ranges from literature that stated what basal area was recorded in different old growth forests in New England and also Pennsylvania. And here's the ranges, so less than 110 square feet per acre, and then up over 180 for the highest score. So this photo I thought was kind of interesting because this is in one of our most popular old growth forests, Cook Forest State Park. And it had actually a really low basal area. It was only around 90 to 180. So it's in this middle to low end range. But the trees in Cook Forest were just so big, and there's also really significant deer pressure here. So there just weren't a lot of trees. So it kind of, I think, is a good example of this is not as important of a feature in Cook Forest State Park, but we do know that this is still an old growth forest. And lastly, numerous large trees being one of the most important features of old growth forests. So this is also something that's sort of hard to take photos of, so I have to try to include people in the photos. The term large tree is a bit subjective. I was talking about some research in New England where they were using 50 centimeters as their cutoff, and I've bumped it up to 60 in Pennsylvania. And that's based on some plot data that we have and just looking at different old growth forests in Pennsylvania, where I really think a 60 centimeter cutoff, or translation here, so or 23 inches is 60 centimeters, is when a tree is starting to get big in Pennsylvania. But however, some of our state champions, and then it's pretty common in old growth forests for the trees to be well over 100 centimeters or 39 inches. But this, however, really isn't defined. And I think it maybe is just, it depends on the site and the local growing conditions. And so the other side of this is the word numerous in here. This is also a bit subjective as well, but I do include parameters in here. So if we're saying one large tree, are we saying more than 3? Are there more than 5? So there's these different categories in the weighted score. The large trees, however, may not be directly next to each other in Pennsylvania old growth, but we do separate each of the points by 50 meters, and that's actually working out really well. You'll see at least a handful of them within eyesight of the center point. Okay, moving on to DBH data. So the diameter of the trees are recorded within a 10-meter radius of the center point tree. We follow the standard heritage protocol, so the minimum size is 10 centimeters or about 3 inches. We incorporated this a little bit late, in 2023. So this sort of thing helps to visualize the structural differences in these forests. I included some graphs here. I apologize for them being a little, I don't have the full numbers on them, but I'll illustrate it anyway. So you can see they both have similar shape, and where the left side shows that there's a high frequency of smaller trees. However, this yellow graph continues to slope slowly to the right, showing that it has a few large trees. And this blue graph abruptly stops, showing it does not have any larger trees. And this graph, Glen Lee, this was in an old growth forest, also at Ricketts Glen, and this was also at Ricketts Glen, but not in an old growth forest. So we can start to see some structural differences between old growth forests and younger stands. So, and lastly, we'll look at land use. Multi-stem trees, cut stumps, and haul roads are all signs of previous land use. Multi-stem trees, such as this photo, is usually a stress response. And this photo shows where it was cut and then the sprouts come back, and so it eventually might turn into something like this. This can arise naturally, though, on a floodplain or after a fire. But forests can recover, so this does not necessarily disqualify a site from being mature or being able to still score highly on this rapid assessment, but it does provide clarity to the site history. Okay, I have some preliminary results from the old growth rapid assessment that I can share from the last 2 years. So these are not meant to be statistically robust. The data set is really limited at this time. So I have the 4 separate weighted scores displayed on these graphs. Each point represents a different site with their score on the y-axis. And currently it is looking like a score of about 60 or higher is representing the old growth forest. So the points are color-coded by sites that were well-known, old growth, and other presumably younger stands that I just have tested the rapid assessment in. So I don't have these labeled because there's so many of them, but some of our most popular old growth sites are the ones that are scoring really highly. But you can see there's a few that are pretty close. Like this one is almost approaching 60, and then some of these are also pretty low. But so far it's looking like if you are just going to use this rapid assessment out in a forest where you really didn't know the age or the site history, if you are getting above 60, then if it's not old growth, then it's maturing, and if you management wise left it alone, it could be considered an old growth forest later on. So I mentioned the main differences between some of these. So these are just different forest types. These are some of our most common plant communities for old growth. But this miscellaneous forest type, these are all lumped together because these were the ones I collected in early on that we did not collect DBH data. So hoping to go back and redo these in order to compare them against the other ones. I've also been making an effort to map old growth sites as I've been surveying them. So, and that's really just as simple as part of the process with doing the rapid assessment in the field is it's best practice to really walk as much of the site as you can, and then just to get a feel for where the old growth might start and end. And as I'm doing that, I'm collecting GPS points along the way, such as seeing big trees here, or I see a haul road here, or I see a unique bark pattern on this tree over here, just taking points along the way. And then when I come back to the computer, then I can end up drawing in a nice polygon for where I think the old growth the core old growth actually is. A lot of the old growth sites I mentioned and others that are on natural areas in Pennsylvania, they're really well buffered, which is great, but then it's kind of hard to figure out actually where the core old growth is. So we're at about 10,400 acres of old growth so far, and this is definitely expected to grow as I'm continuing to get out to other sites. So as this project is still in development, I realize there are a few things missing from the assessment, such as canopy gaps, forest structure, forest regeneration metric, or tree age. I do have some ideas on how to include these. There's some pretty cool research on using remote sensing to analyze canopy gaps. Forest structure, perhaps we could collect more DBH data or in addition to what's in the plot, just to have more numbers. We also do sometimes collect our plant community plots within an old growth forest. And in there, it's much more detailed as what species are in their herbaceous layer, the short shrub, and so on. So perhaps that could count for thinking about forest regeneration metric, where I'm thinking it's important to note the condition of this old growth forest. If there are seedlings of the canopy trees, then that means the forest is regenerating itself. And finally, tree age is we have not been coring trees for this project, and it's mostly just been that I haven't. I'm coming at this from a biology background. I didn't go to forestry school, so I didn't know how really to core trees. And I also noticed that it's really been done a lot of times. There was lots of people putting in the work and putting in the effort for tree coring, and then there's tree ring databases. So I think it was just there's a lot of effort that goes into tree coring. And I'm not really sure how much this will change in the way in the identification of old growth if we try to add these on, but we could at some point. So some of the next steps for this project, I'm going to continue to refine the rapid assessment over this field season, along with perhaps we'll do some more plant community plots. There's some colleagues I have doing that. We're also going to be doing bryophyte surveys and some associated wildlife surveys. So for Swainson's thrush, short green salamander. We also this last year had traps out for terrestrial invertebrates at 2 different old growth sites all season long. So my colleagues are going to be sifting through their catch this winter and this year. So we're hopefully going to get an idea of if these rare species are using old growth forests and what it is about the old growth forests. Can we manage for the structural characteristics that they need? When it comes to bryophytes, can we build an indicator list of if we are seeing these bryophytes in a younger forest, then it's maturing towards old growth. And lastly, I'm creating best management practices for the Pennsylvania DCNR for their old growth forest and mature forest based on this data. So this is what I refer to as my old growth index for Pennsylvania. I've been just collecting sites that are known to be old growth or sites from some big tree enthusiasts. So they're finding large trees in the forest and then putting their locations online. And if I think it looks like it could be old growth based on their photos, I put a point on my map. So you can see there's still lots left to survey for Pennsylvania, and I think we still have plenty to do. So in conclusion, the creating of this old growth rapid assessment and weighted scoring system has been challenging, but interesting to be able to apply a metric based on these structural characteristics. This has coincided with national interest in old growth, and so it's an exciting time to be researching old growth. I do hope this contributes towards the management of old growth or management in old growth forests and mature forests for natural climate solutions. Okay, and this is my last slide. As I mentioned, this project is a work in progress, and I appreciate any comments or feedback that you may have. So my email is on the screen. Thank you for your time and attention. And oh, here's a list of references that I used in the development of this assessment.
Thank you, Jackie. That was really, really terrific. And I have posted the references for everyone. I've actually posted it a couple times. So if you missed the first post, I just put it in chat for you. So we do have some questions. There are several questions related to how you came up with the weights for your metrics, the criteria. Do you mind going into that a little more?
Sure. So coming up with the weights was just a bit of like trial and error. I don't have this, or I didn't point it out, but when I had this screenshot of my Excel document where I'd been doing all the weighted scores, I'm on the ninth version of that. So there was a lot of time just spent like switching things around and seeing how things would work out, but kind of just like going back to this notion of, okay, we still think that numerous large trees and large trees in general, that is the biggest component of an old growth forest. So that's going to have the highest weight in this. And then I was mentioning about those sort of tree features that those are also really good for identifying an old growth forest, but they're not necessarily like those could all be on a single tree. So those kind of being the two extremes, and then fitting in the other ones in the middle of them somewhere. But those are something I'm still working on, and I'm not totally solidified on those numbers at this time. But yeah.
So how about tree height or assessing canopy structure? Have you thought or dealt with those two things?
I do collect the tree height using I'm forgetting what it's called, but you should point it at the top of the canopy. And so we are collecting that, and it hasn't been anything I've included any further than that. I did read some papers about canopy gaps and how to measure canopy gaps and potentially including that into my methods. And I ultimately decided not to. We were referring to this as old growth rapid assessment. And I guess rapid could be subjective. How long
Mhm.
will it actually take? But I really wanted to keep it a little more realistic. And I didn't mention this, but this form will hopefully live on with other natural resources professionals and other forestry folks. So I didn't want it to be too cumbersome.
Mhm.
Um, and so thinking about the canopy gaps, there was also some research I found about remote sensing where you can use LiDAR to actually calculate the amount of gaps in your area in your forest. So that's why I kind of felt like I think I'm just going to not include that on the field component.
Okay. How do you arrange your 200-meter transect within a potential stand? And do you do multiple transects in larger stands?
The transect, so we are just going from the large tree as the first center point, and then we're collecting all the data at that. And then we roughly try to keep it in a relatively straight area. We're not like kind of going zigzag, but going back to this notion of keeping it rapid a little bit easier, we are not laying out a tape in
Okay.
between each of the points. So I took some time to measure how many of my steps actually equal 50 meters. And that's what I'm doing. I start at one tree and then I count my steps. And then, so maybe it's not exactly 50 meters, but as long as we're getting far enough away from that first center point and on to the next to be able to assess those. Um, we do not do multiple at this time, and that's more of just a reflection on time. It just takes a while to like do all of this in a single field day. But I think eventually this could be added on. Like maybe you could even do several points or go in different directions with it. So I could
Mhm.
see something like that in the future.
Okay. I think you addressed this a little bit, some of the additional research that's going on beyond trees. But the question is, what about the supporting OG, the soil, microbes, mycorrhiza, old ground layer species, the whole plant community? Is that being factored in?
The only way I'm doing that at this time is I do collect a small soil sample when we do our plant community plot. But otherwise, it's just not something I've included into this project. But I do really think those are really important for thinking about old growth forests. And I guess like just coming back to this rapid identification of a forest, of an old growth forest, I think underneath those trees, the soil layer definitely is going to have a lot of detail. But for sort of like maybe the average natural resource professional or forester, they're not going to be digging a soil pit, and that's just going to take a lot of time. But I do think it'd be really valuable information for perhaps a more in-depth look at an old growth forest to see those layers and the horizons of the soil and studying the mycorrhizal network.
Okay. In your opinion, would the diversity or homogeneity of the forest in terms of species and or tree heights help identify the old growth forest in addition to some of the other factors you discussed today?
Hmm. Biodiversity. So it's interesting. What comes up for me when I think about that is most of our old growth forests are hemlock types,
Mhm.
and they are not very diverse when it comes to plant species. We're seeing, and then a lot of these places have extreme deer pressure in them. So we're maybe not really seeing anything in the herbaceous
Mhm.
layer. So that combined with the fact that we just have so little old growth and it's just scattered so randomly and incidentally, where it's just kind of like where the harvesters could not get to. Um, I think there's a lot of questions to be answered about diversity and what an old growth mesic forest could look like in
Mhm.
southwestern Pennsylvania. I haven't been to one, so let me know if you know of one.
Post it in
um,
chat if you know.
yeah. So, or like we have over 200 different plant community types in Pennsylvania. So, can we think about old growth versions of some of those? So there's a lot of questions to be answered about diversity, and I think we're just sort of limited on where we can even look at this time.
Okay. Do you have a lichen metric, particularly for species particularly for species characteristic of old growth forests?
No, but I'm hoping to look into that this year. I've got a contact, maybe he's on this call, I'm not sure, but he's going to help me look at lichens and old growth forests. So hopefully going to be adding that on too.
New stuff for next year.
Yep.
Um, let's see. Could you briefly go over methods? On one slide, you referenced a circular plot with a radius of 10 meters. On another, you referenced a 0.03, a zero point 0.3 AC plot, which roughly equates to a circular plot with a radius of 20 meters. Can you clarify? Do you know what slide we're talking about? If not, we can.
I do. So, okay, yeah, each of the circular plots are have a 10-meter radius or 20-meter diameter in total, and there's four of them. So when I did that conversion, so they're talking about the number of large live trees or number of standing dead, large standing dead trees. And I have on there, it's like a certain number per point three of an acre. And that was pulled off of some literature where they were looking at the number of trees per acre. And so I did some conversions with how much area my transect's actually covering. So four of those 20-meter radius or diameter plots was roughly equal to about a third of an acre. So I did some conversions based on the literature for that.
Okay. Um, do you agree with the national definitions for forest types?
Oh, for the feds, I think that's what they're talking about.
Yeah.
I think it's really cool. I think they're doing a lot of really excellent work. I did notice that so I looked at the longer report where it breaks it down by region, and I skipped over the majority of it, and I just looked at the Pennsylvania region since I'm most familiar with that. And that region extends from Pennsylvania, and sorry if I get this wrong, but I think it's like clear up to Minnesota and then also Maine, just a very large area. And I noticed that their trees size I thought was really quite small. If I remember, I think they had it at about 40 centimeters for a tree. Um, and I'm thinking that's really actually quite small for large trees in Pennsylvania. So I define it at more at 60 centimeters for this project. But I just think if they're looking at trees up in Maine versus Pennsylvania, there's just a lot of regional differences. But otherwise, I think their methods and the way they're going about it was really excellent. I've only really taken a dive into it in the last month or two, but I think for some of it, it's kind of like I don't think we really need to be reinventing the wheel. I think we can all work together on this, and there's a lot of really great effort going on.
Yeah, actually, one question does come up regard to tree size and age. wouldn't this be highly dependent on species, that some would naturally be larger? Is it hard to pick sort of that, I'm going to pick 60?
Absolutely. And it comes back to, thinking of, oh, old growth forests have big trees, but not always. Over at Cook Forest State Park, the educator there, Dale Luthringer, showed us he cored these two trees. One was 100 centimeter DBH, one of the big, massive ones. And then right next to it, a much smaller canopy tree. And the much smaller canopy tree was actually older than the big one. So I think it's going to really just, growing conditions really depend a lot. And then, trees, once they have their canopy release and then they can finally grow bigger. Yes, I think it depends a lot on species, and yes, it depends on growing conditions. So, so I say 60 centimeters for the cutoff, but I've used this rapid assessment in forests that I didn't think were old growth, but I'm just going to test it anyway. And so some of those sites, I'm just kind of looking like subjective, like which ones are the big trees in this forest? But they still are almost always around 60 centimeters, or if not much bigger.
Can you speak to how your identifying metrics changed for oak, particularly open oak communities?
I have not really run this in open oak communities, but I do have a couple that I've done in dry oak heath communities, and those are very consistently rocky in Pennsylvania. They're usually ridge lines, they're usually rocky, very dry growing conditions. And that's where I was really starting to notice that the trees were not tipping up and creating this pit and mound topography at all. They were just snapping and when they would die naturally. So then that kind of got me thinking, like, this is not a metric we can really even use in rocky forests at all. So at this point, I have it pulled off of the dry oak heath version, but I could see this also dividing out. Maybe you can do a lot in survey 1, 2, 3. So maybe right at the top of the form, you say, is this rock, like, is there 50% or more rock cover? Yes or no. And then you get 2 separate forms based on that question alone. But yeah, really not in open woodlands or quite yet.
Would you eventually adjust the DBH threshold based on site conditions or forest type? Would you increment coring provide would increment coring provide rationale for adjusting the DBH threshold, perhaps smaller diameter if the trees are old?
Yeah, I like that idea. Yeah, if you got in there right away and you could do a couple of cores and you were seeing that the trees were actually really not all that big, but they were perhaps over 120, 150 years old or something like that, then adjusting that. I think that would be a good idea. I just, haven't really been doing the tree cores to date, just because I feel like it's been a time issue. And I think a lot of the Bureau of Forestry has collected extensive tree coring data as well on most of these natural areas that I'm going out to survey too. So,
since productivity strongly influences tree size and basal area, do you adjust the basal area ranges by site productivity?
no, but that would also be a good idea because I just sort of have these blanket categories right now. But now that's a good thought, because I'm sure I could go back to those research papers I pulled them out of, and they would probably talk about them being mostly in oak or mostly in hemlock forests.
Are you evaluating any of these characteristics in comparison with some of the historic literature, like E.L. Braund's work, characterizing old growth forests through eastern deciduous forest?
No, that would be a good resource as well. Yeah. This has been a really excellent project, and there's been a lot of things to research. So I love these questions. Keep them coming. I have ideas now.
Sure. Isn't that how science grows, right?
Exactly.
Is there a certain year that denotes old, like 75?
Hmm. There's not. There are some definitions I've come across. I think in the federal ones, I think they put a year on it. But I guess if we're just thinking historically, 140-ish years, I would say, is when it's, because maybe then it missed that first deforestation, or maybe it got clear cut right at that time and has been growing ever since. There's been some what is, I believe, the oldest secondary forest in Pennsylvania we have been to for this project, and by all means, it looks like an old growth forest. So these forests can recover.
Okay. Here's an interesting question. Are invasive plants assigned any weight? Have they been
No,
a part of the conversation?
no, but I am thinking about condition when it comes to this as well. So I do have on there just some prompts for me to be thinking about condition. So like, am I seeing hemlock woolly adelgid? Am I seeing invasive plant species? Um, Beech bark disease? These are all throughout. I've really noticed that most of these old growth forests are pretty resilient against invasive plant species. Unless they have really popular hiking trails through them, and that's
Okay.
where you'll see the invasive plants.
I have not been able to, some of the Q&A have commentary also from
Okay.
people sharing from their own experiences and perspectives. So I will share some of what's going on in chat with you and Q&A. So you could, again, like we were just talking, so you can get some ideas from what people are saying. So last question. Um, are there any plans to repeat the surveys over time, either after some type of management or just to monitor change? And if so, do you think it would be important to revisit the exact same 4 plots, or do you think you would get a similar overall score with any 4 large trees in a stand?
That's a great question. So, a part of this project is creating these best management practices for the Bureau of Forestry. And we're still trying to plan some of that out now, but there's some thoughts of doing some of these transects paired. So, we'll do one in the old growth forest, and we pretty much know the boundary of it, where it starts and ends in the natural area. And then usually the Bureau of Forestry still owns land right outside of that, and it's a younger forest, and doing the rapid assessment through there, and perhaps they designate that off limits for timber, and yeah, doing the transects through there, and then considering doing some management. There's lots of great research on managing for old growth, so it's something we're diving into as well. And so then I think it would be interesting to come back and revisit those spots after a certain amount of time. But I kind of get held up on what is the length of time for
Mhm,
that, since this
mhm.
is an old growth forest. Are we talking 10 years? Are we talking 30? It's hard to say.
Right,
Um,
right.
but I don't honestly think it would be that important to come back to the exact spot. Hopefully, the forest would just kind of attain character over time.
Okay. Well, I know we have a hard stop at 1, so I think that we got most of the questions in. And I want to thank you for this. This is fascinating research, and you're clearly, in the early stages. I look forward to hearing more from you as it gets further developed. And I know that everyone on has been contributing ideas, and so I know you'd love to hear from them as well. So thank you so much, Jackie. We appreciate it. Good luck with your continued research, and we look forward to hearing from you again in the future.
All right. Yes. Thank you for having me. And yeah, if you have any other comments, please send me an email. Would love to hear from you.
Okay, everybody, take care. Thank you for joining us today. Goodbye.